Summer, 1942. Warsaw. The German war machine stood at its peak. In the east, millions of Soviet prisoners languished in makeshift camps. In the west, France remained under occupation, its factories feeding the Reich. Within the SS, however, the year was defined not by triumph, but by logistics. The Jewish question, long discussed in ideology and propaganda, had reached its operational phase. Shooting squads, the Einsatzgruppen, had already murdered more than 1 million Jews in forests, ravines and fields across the Soviet Union. But even the SS recognized this method was unsustainable. It was slow, it consumed ammunition, it traumatized soldiers. By June, Reinhard Heydrich, the chief architect of the final solution, was dead, assassinated in Prague by Czech partisans. But his blueprint endured. Operation Reinhard, named in his honor, was the code name for the extermination of Polish Jewry. Himmler gave the order: accelerate, expand, industrialize. Bełżec and Sobibor were already in operation, their gas chambers running, but reports filtered back to Berlin that they were not fast enough. Bełżec processed about 4,000 people per day at maximum capacity. Sobibor somewhat less. At this rate, it would take years to liquidate the ghettos of occupied Poland. The SS wanted a factory of death, a facility designed not for labour, not for detention, but for one purpose only: mass extermination at a pace the world had never seen. That facility would be Treblinka. The decision was made in June 1942. Construction began almost immediately under the supervision of SS officers Odilo Globocnik and Christian Wirth, both veterans of the Action T4 euthanasia program. The lessons of T4, the gassing of disabled Germans in asylums using carbon monoxide, had been transferred wholesale into the new killing centres. Treblinka II, as it was officially called, was built in a matter of weeks, its barracks and chambers thrown up with timber, barbed wire and camouflage netting. By late July it was operational. Unlike Auschwitz, Treblinka was not a hybrid camp. Auschwitz mixed forced labour with extermination, balancing the Reich's hunger for slave labour with its commitment to annihilation. Treblinka dispensed with the pretense. It was not a camp where prisoners might survive months or years. It was a destination, a terminus. Trains entered, people disembarked. Within hours, sometimes within minutes, they were corpses. The SS language reflected this brutal mandate. Internal memoranda avoided words like murder or gassing. Instead, they spoke of processing, throughput, units evacuated. In post-war interrogations, survivors recalled how guards and officers referred to the camp itself as a Betrieb, a business operation, a production facility. Franz Stangl, the commandant who would later stand trial in Düsseldorf, told interviewers in the 1970s that he had been instructed to think of Treblinka not as a camp, but as a factory floor. His task, he admitted, was to ensure the line moved smoothly: train, undressing, chambers, disposal. A sequence of operations optimized for maximum efficiency. The target was staggering: 10,000 to 12,000 dead per day. At peak capacity, Treblinka surpassed even Auschwitz in its killing rate. Between July 1942 and October 1943, in just over 15 months, nearly 900,000 people were murdered there. The SS would later boast that it had created the most efficient death machine of the Holocaust. Efficiency had always been central to Operation Reinhard. Mass shootings in the Soviet Union had revealed both logistical and psychological limits. A report from Einsatzgruppe C noted that executions of more than 200 persons in a single day caused considerable strain on men. Heinrich Himmler himself, observing a mass shooting at Minsk in August 1941, was visibly shaken. He instructed his officers, "Find another method." By 1942, that method was gas. Not poison gas in the chemical warfare sense, but exhaust fumes, carbon monoxide, generated by captured Soviet tank engines. It was crude, but effective. At Betrieb and Sobibor, these gas chambers had proven workable, but bottlenecks slowed operations. Too few chambers, too many delays in unloading trains, difficulties in concealing mass graves. Himmler demanded improvements. Treblinka would incorporate all lessons learned. The blueprint was chillingly simple. A railway spur led into the camp, terminating at a platform disguised as a small rural station. There were fake timetables, a painted clock, even a ticket office, all designed to maintain the illusion that deportees were merely in transit. Beyond the platform lay the undressing yard, where prisoners were forced to strip naked. From there, a narrow camouflaged path known as the tube led directly into the gas chambers. Inside, victims were crammed shoulder to shoulder. The doors sealed. The tank engine roared. In 20 to 30 minutes, silence returned. Bodies were dragged out by Jewish slave labourers, teeth extracted, hair shaved, clothing sorted. The chambers were cleaned. The next transport rolled in. In Auschwitz, prisoners might be selected for work, for medical experiments, for prolonged agony. In Treblinka, there was no selection for survival. Almost everyone who entered was dead within hours. Historians often note this contrast. Auschwitz has become the symbol of the Holocaust, yet Treblinka, far smaller, far less known, killed nearly as many people in a fraction of the time. If Auschwitz was a city of death, Treblinka was an assembly line. The SS themselves acknowledged this. Kurt Franz, Treblinka's deputy commandant, later called it a perfect system. Stangl, when pressed in his trial, admitted that he had felt no direct sense of killing. My conscience was untroubled. My job was to keep order, to keep the process moving. Efficiency had replaced morality. The numbers confirmed the logic. A transport from the Warsaw Ghetto might carry 5,000 to 7,000 people. A single day could see 2, sometimes 3, such transports. Within 24 hours, the population of a town could vanish. The deportations from Warsaw in the summer of 1942 became known among survivors as the Grossaktion. Between July and September, at least 254,000 Jews from Warsaw alone were gassed at Treblinka. In August, daily records note 12,000 to 13,000 arrivals, all processed within hours. The system worked exactly as intended. Treblinka's efficiency did not go unnoticed by the SS hierarchy. Reports circulated praising its throughput compared to Sobibor and Bełżec. Himmler himself visited in early 1943 and was impressed. He ordered modifications to expand chamber capacity, ensuring that the camp could continue processing the influx from liquidated ghettos. When local commanders in Lublin or Warsaw asked where to send transports, the answer was often one word: Treblinka. But for the prisoners, efficiency meant annihilation at unimaginable speed. Survivor Samuel Willenberg, one of the few who escaped during the uprising of August 1943, later recalled, "It was not a camp, it was a factory. People came in, and within hours they were smoke. The SS called Treblinka the perfect death factory. It was not meant as condemnation, but as praise. For them, perfection lay in the elimination of delay, the maximization of throughput, the stripping away of every vestige of humanity." For history, the phrase has endured as evidence of the Holocaust's most chilling dimension: that mass murder was pursued not only with hatred, but with the cold logic of efficiency. Treblinka was not an accident of war. It was not the result of improvisation, chaos, or local initiative. It was designed, carefully, deliberately, with precision, to fulfill one purpose. Unlike Auschwitz, with its multiple roles as labour camp, administrative hub, and extermination centre, Treblinka II was conceived as a pure death facility. Every board, every barbed wire fence, every building was calculated to move human beings from train to grave in the shortest possible time. When construction began in June 1942, The SS engineers already had two templates, Bełżec and Sobibor. Both were functional, but both revealed flaws. Trains backed up, victims resisted, corpses piled too quickly. Odilo Globocnik, Himmler's chief in Lublin and overseer of Operation Reinhard, summoned Christian Wirth, a veteran of the T4 euthanasia program, to refine the model. Wirth's solution was Treblinka, bigger, faster, deadlier. The camp was divided into two main zones. The lower camp contained the railway platform, administrative offices, and barracks for the guards. The upper camp, hidden behind tall wooden fences interlaced with pine branches for camouflage, contained the gas chambers and burial pits. A single narrow passage connected the two zones. The prisoners' final path, cynically nicknamed Der Schlauch, the tube. The deception began immediately upon arrival. Trains pulled into a siding that ended inside the perimeter. To the unsuspecting deportees, it looked like a provincial station. The SS built a wooden facade resembling a ticket office. Signs were painted, a clock added. Survivors later recalled timetables chalked on the walls, as though this were a brief stop on a longer journey east. In truth, the siding was one way. No train ever left with living passengers. The Bahnhof Kommando, a unit of Jewish prisoners forced into service, unloaded the cattle cars. Dogs barked, guards shouted, whips cracked. Those too weak to move were shot where they lay. The rest were herded toward the undressing yard, a large clearing surrounded by barbed wire screens. Here, the architecture served psychology as much as logistics. Prisoners were ordered to undress, men and women separated. Valuables were handed over under the pretense of safekeeping. A sign, recalled by survivors, read, "Remember your number and the place where you left your belongings." It suggested order, bureaucracy, return. In reality, it was the last step before death. SS and Ukrainian guards enforced speed. Prisoners were told they would bathe and be disinfected before continuing to labour camps. In summer, the heat and thirst made the prospect of a shower almost believable. Mothers calmed children with the promise of water. Few suspected the truth until it was too late. From the undressing yard, naked and terrified, victims were driven down the tube. The path was about 100 metres long, fenced on both sides with branches woven tightly to block the view. Dogs lunged at stragglers. Guards beat those who faltered. At the end stood a low building of brick and timber, the gas chambers. The first chambers at Treblinka were small, 6 in total, each measuring about 4 by 4 metres. They could hold 200 people at once. A captured Soviet tank engine, stripped from the battlefield, supplied the carbon monoxide piped inside. But as transports multiplied in August 1942, bottlenecks reappeared. The chambers could not keep pace with the trains arriving from Warsaw and Radom. The solution was expansion. In September, new chambers were built, larger, with reinforced walls. The second-generation facility could kill up to 2,000 people in one gassing cycle. Within half an hour, the building was silent. Prisoners in the Sonderkommando, slave labour units forced to work under constant threat of death, opened the doors, dragged out bodies slick with sweat and excrement, and prepared the chamber for the next group. The process became routine. As one survivor later testified, "It was like a machine. One train left, another entered. It never stopped. At first, corpses were dumped into enormous pits dug by excavators, but the scale of death defied burial. By late summer, decomposing bodies swelled, gases rupturing the earth. The stench spread for kilometres. Himmler himself, visiting in 1943, ordered a radical solution. All bodies must be exhumed and burned. Thus began the construction of cremation pits. Rails from dismantled tracks were laid on concrete supports, forming giant grates. Corpses were stacked in layers, alternated with wood. Gasoline and even human fat, collected in buckets from the burning bodies, were used as fuel. Prisoners of the Sonderkommando worked day and night, feeding the pyres. Ashes were crushed, sifted for gold teeth, and scattered in fields. The SS believed they had erased all traces. The architecture of Treblinka revealed a disturbing truth. The SS did not merely seek to kill. They sought to do so systematically, invisibly, efficiently. Each stage of the layout, the fake station, the undressing yard, the tube, the chambers, was calibrated to reduce resistance and maximize throughput. Franz Stangl described it with chilling candor during his interrogation decades later. "It was not my job to think. My job was to keep the machinery running smoothly. Like a production line, only the product was death." At Auschwitz-Birkenau, selection occurred. Some prisoners were diverted to barracks, to forced labor, to weeks or months of survival before death. Treblinka allowed no such pause. The architecture left no alternative path. Arrival meant annihilation. In Auschwitz, industrial facilities surrounded the crematoria. The SS could pretend that economic purpose justified delay. In Treblinka, there was no justification, no delay. It was a killing machine stripped of disguise, except for the thin veneer of the fake station. This distinction mattered after the war. Survivors of Auschwitz could describe camp life, barracks, labor details, medical experiments. Few survived Treblinka. The architecture ensured that almost none left alive to testify. By autumn 1942, the SS considered Treblinka their most efficient death camp. Globocnik reported to Himmler that the processing of transports was proceeding at unprecedented speed. In one day, an entire town could be extinguished. In 1 month, hundreds of thousands vanished. The architecture made it possible. Every fence, every building, every path was a cog in the machine. To the SS, it was a triumph of design. To history, it remains the most horrifying proof of how architecture can serve not life, but death. The first train arrived at Treblinka on July 23, 1942. It carried Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, the largest Jewish population centre in occupied Europe. For weeks, rumours had spread through the ghetto. Deportations to the east, resettlement in labour camps, families being torn from their homes. Few knew the truth. Even fewer could imagine it. The train that rolled into Treblinka that morning marked the beginning of what survivors later called the Grossaktion, the Great Deportation. In less than 2 months, more than 250,000 Warsaw Jews would be sent to Treblinka and murdered. SS officers and Ukrainian guards awaited the train at the new platform. They were nervous. The camp had been operating only days. The infrastructure was untested, the chambers still new. As the cattle cars screeched to a halt, the doors were thrown open. A wave of sound and stench escaped, the cries of terrified passengers, the reek of sweat and urine, the suffocation of hundreds crammed into each car. Those still alive stumbled into the sunlight, blinking and gasping. Some collapsed immediately, crushed by the journey. Others carried children, bundles of clothing, sacred books. They expected relocation. The SS, with practiced lies, reassured them. Undress for disinfection, hand over valuables, line up for showers. Within an hour, they were dead. Survivors forced into the Bahnhof Kommando, the labour detachment that unloaded the trains, recalled the chaos of those first transports. "We were surrounded by screaming, barking dogs, blows from whips and rifle butts," one later testified. People tried to ask questions. No one answered. We were ordered to strip and move. Then they were gone. The camp's design was tested under fire. Trains arrived daily, sometimes more than once. In the first week, 40,000 Warsaw Jews were processed. The system revealed its strengths and flaws. Strength, speed. From arrival to death, the process took less than 2 hours. A train arriving in the morning could be emptied, its passengers gassed, and the chambers cleaned by noon. Another transport could be handled by evening. Weakness, capacity. In the first days, the 6 small chambers proved insufficient. The backlog of corpses overwhelmed the burial pits. SS overseers demanded larger chambers immediately, leading to September's expansion. Franz Stangl, newly appointed commandant, reported back to Lublin that Treblinka could process entire ghettos without pause. To the SS, these were logistical achievements, measured not in lives, but in numbers, in units resettled. For the Jews of Warsaw, the deportations were apocalyptic. Each day, thousands were herded to the Umschlagplatz, the railhead in the ghetto. SS men with lists selected building by building. Families were torn apart. Mothers carried infants, the elderly leaned on children, men and women clutched each other in confusion. Deportees were told they were bound for labour camps. Posters promised bread and work. The reality was Treblinka. By August 1942, the transports reached their peak. Some days saw 12,000 to 13,000 people shipped north to the camp. Trains left Warsaw in the morning, and by evening their human cargo had vanished. Entire neighbourhoods were emptied in days. Warsaw, once the vibrant centre of Jewish culture in Poland, was being erased at the speed of trains and engines. Survivor testimony from Treblinka is rare. Only about 70 people survived out of nearly 900,000 victims. But their words reveal what those first transports endured. Samuel Willenberg, deported later in 1942, described how prisoners were forced naked into the chambers. People pressed from behind, no space, the doors slammed. We heard the engine start. Screaming, crying. After a time, silence. When the doors opened, they fell like a wall, bodies entangled, mouths open, eyes staring. The Sonderkommando, forced to remove the corpses, recalled the brutality of efficiency. We pulled them out by the arms, by the legs. The floor was wet, slippery. We had to drag them to the pits, pile them like wood. Children, old people, everyone together. For the SS, this was not horror. It was procedure. The victims were numbers. Stangl later admitted he thought of them as cargo. The first transports established Treblinka's lethal rhythm. By the end of August 1942, more than 300,000 Jews from Warsaw had been murdered. Transports also began arriving from Radom, Lublin, Białystok, and smaller ghettos. Treblinka's daily capacity reached 10,000 to 12,000 deaths, rivaling Auschwitz at its peak. This was industrial killing, and the SS knew it. Globocnik reported to Himmler that the evacuation of the Warsaw Ghetto is proceeding with great efficiency. Himmler, pleased, ordered the pace maintained. For the deportees, deception remained intact until the final moments. Many believed they were bound for labour camps. The fake station, the promise of showers, the commands to fold clothes neatly, all reinforced the illusion. Panic erupted only at the last stage, inside the chambers, when air grew thin and the engine roared. But by then it was too late. Some realized earlier. Mothers tried to hide children. Elderly men whispered prayers. A few attempted resistance, striking guards, shouting warnings. They were shot immediately. The system tolerated no delay. One survivor later said, "The speed was the worst part." You could not grasp what was happening. By the time you understood, you were already gone. The first transports proved Treblinka's design. The SS measured success in train schedules, chamber turnover, corpse disposal. By September, Stangl called the operation smooth, orderly, without disruption. To him, this was the mark of success. For the victims, it was catastrophe beyond words. Warsaw's centuries-old Jewish community, rabbis, scholars, writers, children, disappeared into Treblinka's pits and flames. Within weeks, a civilization was gone. Treblinka's first weeks set the pattern for the next 15 months. Train after train, day after day, ghetto after ghetto. Each transport arrived, was processed, and disappeared. The system never stopped. The first transports were the beginning of what would become one of the most concentrated killing sprees in human history. By the autumn of 1942, Treblinka had achieved its efficiency. Transports arrived daily. Tens of thousands were murdered each week. But efficiency created a problem the SS could not ignore: the bodies. At first, victims were buried in enormous pits, trenches gouged out of the sandy soil by excavators and prisoner labour. Thousands of corpses were dumped in layers, covered with lime and hastily filled with sand. But as weeks passed, decomposition transformed the camp into a landscape of horror. The ground swelled as gases built up beneath the surface. Dogs dug at the shallow graves. The stench carried for miles, betraying the secret that the SS claimed to hide. Villagers nearby spoke of mountains that moved. Farmers could not work their fields. Trains passing along the nearby lines slowed as passengers covered their noses against the overwhelming odour. Even the SS complained. It was impossible to stand near the pits, recalled Kurt Franz, later deputy commandant. The air was unbearable. In late 1942, Heinrich Himmler inspected Operation Reinhard camps. By then, tens of thousands of bodies lay in mass graves at Treblinka, Bełżec and Sobibor. Himmler, obsessed with secrecy, feared discovery. The Soviet advance threatened to expose the crime scenes. He ordered immediate concealment. The directive was clear: all bodies must be exhumed and destroyed. No graves, no evidence. What remained was to be ash, indistinguishable from the soil. This was not just an order of concealment. It was a new phase of extermination. Now the SS had to design a system not only to kill efficiently, but to erase efficiently. Christian Wirth, inspector of Operation Reinhard, devised the method. At Treblinka, SS and Ukrainian guards forced prisoners to dig massive open-air pits, some 250 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 15 feet deep. Across the pits, iron railway tracks were laid on concrete blocks, forming giant grills. Corpses were dragged from the burial pits and stacked on the grills, layer upon layer, alternating with wood. Gasoline and diesel were poured over the heaps. Then the pyres were lit. Prisoners described the spectacle with horror. Flames leapt high, smoke rose for miles, ash rained on the camp like snow. The smell of burning flesh and hair was suffocating. It was like hell opened on earth, remembered one prisoner. Each pyre could consume thousands of bodies at once. Once reduced to bone and ash, the remains were crushed with hammers and ground into powder by machines. The ash was scattered in surrounding fields, mixed with sand to disguise it. By 1943, Treblinka had become not just a factory of death, but a factory of erasure. The work was done by prisoners of the Sonderkommando, the work units forced to handle corpses. They were chosen for strength, often kept alive only briefly before being killed themselves. They dragged bodies bloated from decay, pulled gold teeth, cut hair, and heaved corpses onto the grills. Many testified after the war to the psychological torment of this labour. "We worked with bodies of our families," one recalled. "I found my wife and children among them. I had to burn them with my own hands." For the SS, this cruelty was deliberate. By making Jews complicit in the concealment of Jewish deaths, they aimed to dehumanize both victims and executioners. As with the gas chambers, the cremation pits were refined for efficiency. Wirth demanded maximum throughput. The SS experimented with pyre design. Layering corpses with wood produced hotter, faster burns. Fat from burning bodies dripped onto lower levels, acting as fuel. Continuous feeding kept pyres going day and night. At peak, Treblinka's pyres could consume 2,000 to 3,000 corpses daily. Records from post-war investigations estimated that between late 1942 and summer 1943, hundreds of thousands of bodies were exhumed and burned. The SS treated concealment as policy, not improvisation. Orders from Berlin emphasized secrecy above all. Local villagers were kept away. Guards patrolled roads. Overhead flights were monitored. Prisoners were forbidden from speaking about their work on pain of instant death. In the camp's bureaucratic language, concealment was described in neutral technical terms. Reports referred to cleansing of grounds and sanitization. For perpetrators, this was not a crime, but an administrative necessity, an engineering project to maintain the integrity of the operation. For prisoners forced into this machinery of concealment, survival meant enduring the unendurable. Many later said that burning the corpses was even more traumatic than unloading the transports. It was slow, intimate, unavoidable. They inhaled the smoke, handled the ashes, scattered the bones. The SS too were affected, though in different ways. Some complained about the smell, the endless smoke, the labour of overseeing such work. Others became desensitized, turning mass cremation into routine. Kurt Franz treated the pyres as background to his daily duties, training his dog Barry, taking photographs of prisoners, keeping albums. The concealment process coincided with the aftermath of the Warsaw Ghetto deportations. Hundreds of thousands murdered that summer now had their remains exhumed, burned, and obliterated. What had been Jewish Warsaw was now not only emptied of its people, but of their traces. The SS intended that no evidence of their existence should remain. Yet concealment was never perfect. Ashes blew across the countryside. Bones too large to be crushed remained in fields. Villagers collected them as proof. After the war, investigators found fragments of charred skulls, teeth and bones scattered across Treblinka's grounds. The attempt at erasure failed, though the SS did everything in its power to destroy the record. In SS evaluations, Treblinka was called the perfect death factory because it combined speed of killing with systematic concealment. Unlike Auschwitz, which left vast archives and living witnesses, Treblinka left little paper trail and was designed to leave no trace of its victims. But the survivors, the few who escaped, the forced labourers who witnessed, preserved the truth. They testified that concealment was not an afterthought, but central to the camp's purpose. To kill a people was one thing, to erase them entirely was another. Treblinka attempted both. By late 1943, the pits burned day and night. Thousands of corpses turned to ash week after week, month after month. For the SS, it was a solution. For the prisoners, it was a nightmare without end. For history, it was the evidence of a crime so vast that even fire could not obliterate it. Killing was Treblinka's central purpose, but death was not the camp's only harvest. Behind the walls, alongside gas chambers and cremation pits, ran another system, the systematic plunder of the dead. Every transport brought not only human lives, but also possessions, clothing, jewellery, and currency. For the SS, these were resources to be collected, sorted, and shipped to the Reich. In their bureaucratic vision, mass murder generated not only death, but also profit. The process began the moment transports arrived. Victims were ordered to leave luggage on the platform. SS officers assured them their belongings would be returned after delousing. The lie encouraged compliance, reducing panic. In reality, the luggage never moved with its owners. Prisoners from the Sonderkommando units carried suitcases, bags, and parcels to sorting barracks. They emptied contents onto long wooden tables: clothing, shoes, bedding, kitchenware, family photos, toys. Everything people had taken for a new life, one survivor recalled, was laid out for stealing. Next came the people themselves. Victims were forced to undress completely before entering the gas chambers. Piles of clothing rose high, shoes stacked in heaps, spectacles collected in crates. Hair was shorn from women's heads, stored in sacks for shipment to factories in Germany where it was used for textiles. Nothing escaped the SS net. Once collected, belongings entered a vast sorting operation. Treblinka's warehouses overflowed with goods. Prisoner labourers separated clothing by quality, repairing what could be reused. Better garments were packed and sent to Germany to be distributed among civilians and bombed-out families. Shoes were paired, leather salvaged, soles removed for military use. The most coveted were valuables. Gold coins, watches, wedding rings and jewellery were pried from hidden folds in clothing. Gold teeth were wrenched from corpses by prisoner dentists with pliers. SS officers supervised closely. Theft for personal gain was punishable, though guards frequently skimmed jewels for themselves. Officially, valuables were packed in sealed chests marked Reinhard Action and shipped to the Reichsbank in Berlin. In 1943 alone, shipments from Treblinka and the other Operation Reinhard camps delivered hundreds of kilograms of gold, silver and platinum, as well as millions in foreign currency. A post-war Allied investigation calculated that the SS transferred enough stolen gold to strengthen Germany's war economy at a moment of desperate need. The numbers reveal the enormity of this economy. According to the Korher report, between 1942 and 1943, Operation Reinhard camps murdered over 1.7 million Jews. Each deportee brought belongings, some meagre, some significant. Added together, the plunder reached staggering levels. Gold and currency, tens of millions of Reichsmarks worth. Clothing, millions of garments, enough to clothe entire German towns. Shoes, stored in mountain-like piles, later distributed to civilians and troops. Textiles, human hair, blankets, linens, sent to the Reich's war industries. Treblinka became a hub in this machinery. Survivors remembered barracks so full of possessions that prisoners waded through clothing as through snow. The SS described this process in economic terms. Official memoranda listed quotas of recovered goods. They did not write of stolen lives, but of deliveries, stocks, and shipments. Bureaucratic efficiency disguised mass theft as administrative routine. One report recorded the transfer of 2,600 kilograms of women's hair to the Reich's textile industry. Another noted 400,000 watches gathered across Operation Reinhard camps. At every stage, accountants measured, weighed, and recorded. Murder was stripped of morality and reduced to logistics. For Himmler and Globocnik, commander of Operation Reinhard, this plunder was a justification. They claimed the Jewish property returned to the German people offset the costs of extermination. In their distorted calculus, genocide became self-financing. For prisoners forced into the sorting barracks, the work was another torment. They handled the possessions of the murdered, children's toys, letters, prayer books, family photographs. Each item testified to a life destroyed. Survivors recalled the emotional torture of discovering familiar objects. One prisoner recognized his neighbor's coat. Another found a prayer shawl identical to his father's. Some secretly rescued photographs, hiding them in clothing, small acts of defiance against erasure. The SS, meanwhile, treated the warehouses as private markets. Officers walked the aisles, choosing clothing or jewellery for their families. Kurt Franz was seen selecting boots. Guards pocketed watches, sometimes sending them home as gifts. The camp became not only a death factory, but also a thieves' bazaar. Once sorted, shipments left Treblinka by rail under SS escort. Boxes of gold reached Berlin, where they were melted down at the Reichsbank. Precious metals entered the German economy indistinguishable from legitimate reserves. Stolen currency was laundered into state coffers. Clothing was disinfected, repaired, and distributed by the German Red Cross to civilians bombed out of their homes. Millions of German families unknowingly wore garments stripped from the dead of Treblinka. This concealment extended the crime. Not only were Jews erased in death, their very belongings were absorbed into the German social fabric, rendering absence invisible. For the SS, the plunder reinforced the illusion of efficiency. Treblinka killed quickly, disposed of bodies systematically, and converted possessions into usable resources. Internal evaluations praised the camp as self-sustaining. In reality, the economy of plunder masked theft on a continental scale. When Operation Reinhard ended in late 1943, Himmler reported with pride that the program had contributed vast wealth to the Reich. But behind the numbers were millions of lives, their deaths financed by their own possessions. After the war, survivors spoke of the plunder as vividly as the gas chambers. They remembered the mountains of shoes, the piles of clothing taller than houses, the SS officers pocketing watches while smoke from cremation pits filled the air. To them, the theft symbolized the Nazis' complete dehumanization of their victims. "They took everything," one said, "our lives, our families, even our hair." At Treblinka, genocide was not only murder, it was robbery on an industrial scale, the transformation of human existence into resources, measured in kilograms of gold, in tons of clothing, in crates of children's toys. Treblinka's reputation as the perfect death factory rested not only on its killing speed, but also on its integration of murder and plunder. Nothing was wasted, not even the ashes. The system consumed lives and possessions alike, leaving behind only absence. In this way, the camp fulfilled the SS vision of efficiency: death as production, theft as industry, genocide as economics. By the summer of 1943, Treblinka had operated for over a year. Hundreds of thousands were dead, their bodies burned, their belongings plundered. The SS called it the perfect death factory, but the machine was beginning to falter. Transports dwindled as the ghettos of Poland were emptied. Soviet forces pressed from the east. And inside the camp, prisoners who had been forced to operate the machinery of extermination began to plan rebellion. Prisoners of the Sonderkommando knew their fate. They had seen the cycle. Forced labourers survived a few weeks or months, then were themselves murdered and replaced. "We understood that no one would leave alive," one survivor later recalled. That knowledge bred desperation and determination. Small groups began to meet secretly in the barracks. They whispered at night, away from guards, sharing scraps of information. The plan was not to escape the camp entirely, few believed that possible, but to strike at the SS, destroy what they could, and break free in chaos. If only a handful survived to tell the world, that would be victory. The uprising was led by men like Dr. Julian Chorążycki, a former Polish army officer and physician, and later Dr. Berek Lejcha, another Polish officer deported with his family. They worked with fellow prisoners, including Jewish survivors from Warsaw who smuggled news of resistance outside the camp. Weapons were scarce, guards patrolled constantly, and searches were frequent. But prisoners found ways. They stole grenades and rifles piece by piece from SS armories. They fabricated keys to unlock weapons depots. A bribe to a Ukrainian guard bought pistols. Tools from the workshops, axes, knives, hammers, became weapons in waiting. Most crucial was fuel. The cremation pyres consumed gasoline daily, and prisoners secretly siphoned some away. They filled bottles, sealed them with rags, preparing Molotov cocktails. Fire would be their ally. The uprising was scheduled for August 2nd, 1943, a hot summer afternoon. Timing was critical. Many SS officers would be swimming at the nearby Bug River, leaving fewer guards inside. The conspirators aimed to seize weapons, set fire to buildings, cut phone lines, and storm the gates. Some would die in the assault, others in the minefield surrounding the camp. But some, they hoped, would reach the forest. That day, Treblinka seemed almost ordinary. Transports arrived, victims were herded to gas chambers, smoke rose from the cremation pits. But in the barracks, tension was unbearable. Prisoners whispered final prayers, tightened hidden knives in their belts. At 3:45 p.m., the signal came. A shot rang out. Prisoners surged into action. They hurled Molotov cocktails at storage sheds, flames leaping skyward. Smoke filled the camp. Barracks caught fire. Explosions from ammunition stores echoed. The illusion of order collapsed. Armed prisoners stormed the armory, seizing rifles, pistols, grenades. Others attacked guards with axes and shovels. Gunfire crackled across the compound. Ukrainian guards panicked, some fleeing, others firing wildly into the crowd. The SS scrambled to respond. Commandant Franz Stangl was absent, but his deputy Kurt Franz rushed to rally defences. SS men opened machine guns on prisoners charging the gates. Bodies fell in heaps, but others kept running. The camp itself burned. Flames devoured warehouses filled with plunder. Ammunition exploded in violent bursts. Smoke from the uprising mixed with the eternal smoke of cremation pits. But this fire was not concealment. It was defiance. Prisoners surged toward the outer fence. Some cut wire with stolen tools. Others hurled themselves onto barbed barriers, creating human bridges for comrades to climb over. Beyond lay a minefield. Dozens were blown apart in desperate sprints. Yet some made it through, racing into the surrounding woods. Of the roughly 700 prisoners in Treblinka that day, perhaps 300 broke free of the fences. SS reinforcements pursued with dogs, horses and machine guns. Many were recaptured, executed on the spot, but around 70 survivors ultimately escaped to freedom, living to bear witness. The revolt stunned the SS. Treblinka had been designed for order, silence and secrecy. Now its warehouses smouldered, its fences torn, its myth of perfection shattered. Though most prisoners were killed, the uprising proved that even in a place built solely for death, resistance was possible. The Germans moved quickly to restore control. Within days, surviving labourers were executed. By the autumn of 1943, the SS dismantled Treblinka altogether. Buildings were torn down, the ground ploughed over, lupines planted to hide the site. A farmhouse was built where the commandant's office had stood, staffed by a Ukrainian family as camouflage. The camp had murdered nearly 900,000 people. Now the SS sought to erase it. But the revolt ensured Treblinka could not vanish entirely. Survivors like Samuel Willenberg, Richard Glazar and others escaped to join partisan units or hide among sympathetic villagers. They carried the story with them. After the war, their testimonies became crucial evidence. They described the gas chambers, the cremation pits, the plunder, the revolt itself. In trials decades later, their voices broke the SS silence. Treblinka was built to leave no survivors, Willenberg testified, but we lived to speak. For history, the uprising of August 2nd, 1943, became more than a desperate act of survival. It was a declaration. Even in the most totalized system of death, humans found the will to resist. Armed with little more than axes, fire and courage, the prisoners of Treblinka struck at their captors and scarred the machinery of genocide. The SS called Treblinka the perfect death factory. But the uprising proved its imperfection. No system of terror, however efficient, could extinguish the human will to fight back. By late 1943, Treblinka lay in ruins. The fields where once trains arrived daily were silent. Ashes mingled with soil. Wildflowers grew where gas chambers had stood. But the revolt had ensured that the camp's story would not be erased. The perfect death factory had burned, if only for an afternoon, long enough to ignite memory, testimony and truth. When the fires of revolt died down and the SS dismantled Treblinka in late 1943, it seemed as though the camp would vanish into the soil. By design, there were no archives, no detailed records, no intact buildings. The ground had been ploughed, grass sown, and a farmhouse built to disguise the site. For the perpetrators, this was the final act of concealment. Treblinka would become a ghost, invisible to history. But memory is stubborn. The handful of survivors who escaped during the uprising carried with them more than scars. They carried testimony. In the years that followed, their words, alongside captured German documents and post-war interrogations, pulled Treblinka back from erasure. In 1944, as the Red Army advanced, Soviet investigators reached Treblinka's grounds. They found a barren clearing, scattered with bone fragments and ash. Farmers in nearby villages pointed to the strange soil, heavy with remains. Though the SS had tried to obliterate the evidence, Traces were everywhere: charred teeth, splinters of bone, shards of burned skull. The Soviets gathered statements from local villagers who had smelled the stench for months, who had seen trains vanish behind barbed wire and return empty. These early reports confirmed what escapees had already told Jewish underground groups. Treblinka was not a labour camp, but a killing centre. Survivor testimonies deepened the record. Samuel Reisman, who had escaped during the revolt, joined the Polish underground and later appeared as a witness at the Nuremberg trials in 1946. He described the gas chambers, the cremation pits, the systematic theft of property. "I saw with my own eyes," he told the tribunal, "thousands of people driven into the gas chambers in a single day." The SS men who had commanded Treblinka scattered after the camp's liquidation. Some died before war's end. Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated in 1942. Christian Wirth was killed by partisans in 1944, but others blended into post-war Europe. Franz Stangl, Treblinka's commandant, fled through the rat lines to Brazil, working in factories under a false name until captured in 1967. Kurt Franz, the camp's deputy, returned quietly to Germany, working as a cook until his arrest in the 1950s. Ukrainian guards slipped back into Eastern Europe, many escaping accountability altogether. For years, justice seemed uncertain. Only with persistent survivor testimony and investigative work in the 1960s did large-scale trials begin. In 1964, the Treblinka trials opened in Düsseldorf, West Germany. 11 former SS personnel faced charges of mass murder. Survivors took the stand, facing their tormentors across the courtroom. Samuel Willenberg, one of the few survivors of the revolt, described the daily killing process. Richard Glazar, another escapee, recounted the sorting of belongings, the cremation pits, the revolt itself. Their testimonies provided not only evidence, but also living memory, a human voice against the silence the SS had tried to impose. The verdicts came in 1965. Franz Stangl was sentenced to life imprisonment. Kurt Franz, too, received life. Others received lesser sentences, but the trials established Treblinka in public consciousness. The judges called it the most terrible crime in human history. Post-war estimates concluded that approximately 870,000 Jews were murdered at Treblinka between July 1942 and October 1943, making it the second deadliest Nazi extermination camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. Unlike Auschwitz, however, Treblinka produced almost no survivors. Of the hundreds of thousands who entered, only about 70 escaped to tell their story. This absence shaped its memory. Auschwitz became a global symbol, with intact barracks and gas chambers preserved. Treblinka remained a scar in the earth, invisible but no less vast in its destruction. For decades, survivors fought to ensure it was not forgotten. In the decades after the war, Treblinka was often overshadowed by Auschwitz in historical writing, but survivors refused silence. They published memoirs, gave testimony, returned to the site. Samuel Willenberg, who lived in Israel, devoted his life to remembrance, creating sculptures that depicted scenes from the camp. Richard Glazar published Trap with a Green Fence, a searing memoir. Polish, Israeli and Jewish organizations pushed for recognition. In the 1960s, a memorial was erected at the site. 17,000 stones standing in a vast field, symbolizing lost communities. One large stone in the center bears the name Treblinka. Unlike Auschwitz, no buildings remain, only stones, earth and silence. Some SS men confessed reluctantly. Franz Stangl, in interviews with journalist Gitta Sereni shortly before his death in 1971, admitted his role but framed himself as a bureaucrat following orders. He described Treblinka as a production line, revealing the very language of efficiency that survivors had testified to. "My conscience is clear," he insisted, even as he acknowledged supervising the murder of nearly 1 million. Others denied, evaded, or minimized. Yet even their evasions testified to the scale. No one could deny the transports, the ashes, the vanished Jewish communities of Poland. The silence itself was evidence. Treblinka's reckoning was not only judicial, but historical. Historians in the 1970s and 1980s began to piece together the camp's story from scattered sources: survivor testimonies, perpetrator confessions, captured documents. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem later included Treblinka as a central case study of industrial genocide. By the 1980s, Treblinka became a site of pilgrimage. Survivors, children of survivors, and international visitors came to the stone memorial. They stood in silence where gas chambers once stood, where ash still lay in the soil. The reckoning of Treblinka is incomplete. Most perpetrators escaped justice. Many victims' names remain unknown, their families obliterated. The camp itself left no buildings, no archives, only earth infused with ash. Yet the revolt of August 1943, the trials of the 1960s, the testimonies of survivors, and the memorial stones ensure that Treblinka cannot be erased. It remains a symbol of efficiency turned toward inhuman ends, of how a system can be designed to kill quickly, conceal completely, and profit from death. In the end, Treblinka's reckoning rests not only in courts or history books, but in memory itself. Survivors passed their stories to the next generations, defying the SS vision of a crime without witnesses. As Samuel Willenberg said shortly before his death in 2016, "I am a soldier of memory. We were meant to vanish without a trace, but as long as I speak, Treblinka will be remembered." Treblinka's silence is not emptiness, it is a silence that speaks. Where barracks and gas chambers once stood, there are now fields of stone, each marker carved to represent a destroyed Jewish community. Visitors describe the site as unsettling precisely because so little remains. Unlike Auschwitz, where buildings and barbed wire endure, Treblinka forces imagination to bridge the gap between absence and memory. This absence is its legacy. The Nazis intended to erase the camp, but in doing so they created a symbol of annihilation so total it can only be remembered through testimony, memorials, and the earth itself. In 1964, a monument was unveiled at Treblinka. At its centre stands a cracked stone tower, evoking both a shattered tombstone and a broken world. Surrounding it are over 17,000 smaller stones, each representing a Jewish town or community whose people were sent to die here. Inscribed among them are names: Warsaw, Białystok, Radom, Częstochowa, places once vibrant with Jewish life, now extinguished. The memorial was deliberately abstract. No gas chambers, no barracks were reconstructed. Instead, the stones leave space for silence and grief. Survivors approved. Nothing could capture Treblinka as it was, but the stones gave form to absence. Each year, commemorations are held at the site. Survivors came while they lived, often with children and grandchildren. Polish officials, Israeli delegations, and international visitors gather in ceremonies that blend mourning with education. The cracked stone remains the camp's most enduring image, a monument to the destruction of communities, not just individuals. Because so few survived Treblinka, each testimony carried immense weight. Samuel Willenberg, Richard Glazar, and a handful of others became guardians of memory. Willenberg, in particular, dedicated his life to educating youth, leading tours to Treblinka, and producing sculptures that depicted scenes from the camp: men dragging corpses, women clutching children, prisoners hauling stones. His art served as a form of testimony, a way to transmit memory to those who could not hear him speak. These survivors' words entered textbooks, museums, and trials. They shaped public understanding of Treblinka as a pure extermination camp, distinct from labour camps or concentration camps. Their insistence on speaking countered the Nazi hope that the camp's erasure would erase its crime. With the passing of survivors in the early 21st century, their testimonies became recorded history, preserved in film, interviews, and archives. The Shoah Foundation, Yad Vashem, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum hold hours of video testimony, ensuring that even when no survivors remain, their voices will endure. Historians have long grappled with Treblinka's place in Holocaust history. Early post-war years focused heavily on Auschwitz, partly because it left physical remains and more survivors. Treblinka, with its near-total destruction, seemed harder to study. Yet by the 1970s, detailed research based on testimonies, trial records, and forensic investigation brought Treblinka to the forefront. Scholars like Yitzhak Arad and Christopher Browning emphasized its role in Operation Reinhard, the deadliest phase of the Holocaust, in which 1.7 million Jews were murdered in Bełżec, Sobibor, and Treblinka within less than 2 years. Operation Reinhard represented not only genocide, but also theft on a massive scale. Valuables from victims were funneled into the Reich's economy. Treblinka embodied this logic most starkly, where killing and plunder were industrialized. Modern research has confirmed Treblinka's death toll, around 870,000, through analysis of deportation records, railway documents, and Nazi correspondence. Forensic archaeology has located burial pits and ash layers beneath the soil, validating survivor testimony. Each investigation reinforces the camp's historical reality against denial. Holocaust denialists have often targeted Treblinka precisely because it left few physical traces. They claim the lack of surviving structures is proof of fabrication. Survivors and historians, however, counter with overwhelming evidence: transport records, testimonies, aerial photographs, and forensic analysis. In 2010, a team led by forensic archaeologist Caroline Sturdy-Coles conducted non-invasive surveys of Treblinka's grounds. They confirmed the presence of mass graves and remnants of cremation pits. Their work demonstrated that absence of buildings does not equal absence of crime. The earth itself holds evidence. Survivors like Willenberg and Glaser addressed denial directly. "I was there," Willenberg repeated in countless interviews, "and I speak so no one can say it did not happen." His very survival was an answer to denial. Treblinka's story has entered literature, film, and education. In Jean-François Steiner's 1966 book, Treblinka, the revolt is told as a parable of resistance. Claude Lanzmann's monumental film, Shoah, 1985, devoted a major section to Treblinka, filming survivors and villagers at the site. Lanzmann's choice to show the empty landscape underscored how absence itself testifies. In classrooms across the world, Treblinka is taught as part of the broader Holocaust narrative, but also as a case study in bureaucratized mass murder. Teachers highlight its efficiency, its concealment, and its near-total erasure as lessons in how genocide can be engineered. The SS once boasted of Treblinka as the perfect death factory. The phrase captures both the camp's horror and its lesson for posterity. Efficiency, when applied to dehumanization, can yield unimaginable atrocity. Treblinka was designed with no purpose but killing, no labor, no survival. It stands as the ultimate warning of what industrial rationality can achieve when stripped of morality. For post-war generations, Treblinka became a symbol of absolute evil. Survivors often described it not as a place, but as an abyss, a point at which civilization collapsed. Its very invisibility, its vanished buildings, its obliterated archives, became part of its meaning. Treblinka was not only a site of genocide, it was an attempt at historical erasure. Today, Treblinka's legacy is threefold. Historical. It reminds us of the mechanics of genocide: planning, deception, transport, killing, erasure. Moral. It demonstrates that efficiency and obedience, when paired with ideology, can destroy humanity. Memory. It obligates the living to remember, because the perpetrators sought silence. Visitors to Treblinka often remark on the stillness, the quiet of the forest and fields. Birds sing, grass grows, but beneath the soil lie ashes of nearly 1 million. The cracked stone monument stands not only for the dead, but for the truth itself, fractured but unbroken. As Samuel Willenberg declared, Treblinka has no survivors, only witnesses remain. And we, the few who lived, pass the torch. If the world remembers, then Treblinka is not victorious. If the world forgets, then it wins again.